Morning everyone and welcome to Mindspeak, our first Mindspeak of 2015. I decided because there were so many things happening in the world today, I thought I'd try and touch on some of the items that interest me and hopefully are going to be of interest to all of you. And I was walking outside and I saw Giuliani, and Giuliani said to me, and this is a little bit of a diversion, he said, serendipity. And I remember writing on a tweet one day that I believed in serendipity, and he's never let me forget it. And serendipity is something like this, where you bring people together, where there's a group of people and things happen because of the collection. It's sort of luck, making your own luck, but making things happen. So thanks to all of you guys for being here. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the support tremendously. You know, I was thinking of what am I going to talk about, and this is a photograph in the back there of Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol, probably one of the most expensive artists these days, and he was a great commentator on contemporary affairs in a very artistic way. And he said, you know, the world fascinates me, and the world is so fascinating at the moment, so many things happening. If I may touch on one quotation, and I think this is what, you know, if somebody says, what do you actually do? What are you trying to do? Stanley Druckenmiller was George Soros's trading partner, and they were the ones who made £1 billion from the Bank of England when the pound fell out of the exchange rate mechanism. And he said about what he did, he says, as a macro investor, my job for 30 years was to anticipate changes in the economic trends, but I think we can anticipate them in the political trends as well, that were not expected by others and therefore not reflected in securities prices. And he was talking essentially about, you know, being a trader, looking for opportunities where the market is clearly mispriced and then exploiting them. And it resonates with me as a way of looking at life. The first thing that I think one can say in 2015 is that it's more adversarial than ever before. Adversarial, you have Putin on one side, you have a much more stressed out, I call it a rhythmic world, where there's plenty of things which could geopolitically pop over the radar. When I plugged Arrhythmic into my computer, it threw this up. For years, he'd been studying the phenomenon of chaos, of which an arrhythmic heartbeat was a perfect example. And I'll tell you why, and I want to play you a video. This video is a little bit Anglo-centric, but I think the point he's making applies to everything today.
So much of the news this year has been hopeless, depressing, and above all, confusing. To which the only response is, oh dear. But what this film is going to suggest is that that defeatist response has become a central part of a new system of political control. And to understand how this is happening, you have to look to Russia, and to a man called Vladislav Surkov, who is a hero of our time. Surkov is one of President Putin's advisors, and has helped him maintain his power for 15 years. But he has done it in a very new way.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
He came originally from the avant-garde art world, and those who have studied his career say that what Surkov has done is import ideas from conceptual art into the very heart of politics. His aim is to undermine people's perception of the world, so they never know what is really happening. Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theatre. He sponsored all kinds of groups, from neo-Nazi skinheads to liberal human rights groups. He even backed parties that were opposed to President Putin. But the key thing was that Surkov then let it be known that this was what he was doing, which meant that no one was sure what was real or fake. As one journalist put it, it's a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused, a ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it's indefinable. Which is exactly what Surkov is alleged to have done in the Ukraine this year. In typical fashion, as the war began, Surkov published a short story about something he called non-linear war. A war where you never know what the enemy are really up to, or even who they are. The underlying aim, Surkov says, is not to win the war, but to use the conflict to create a constant state of destabilized perception in order to manage and control. But maybe we have something similar emerging here in Britain. Everything we're told by journalists and politicians is confusing and contradictory. Of course, there is no Mr. Surkov in charge, but it's an odd, non-linear world that plays into the hands of those in power. British troops have come home from Afghanistan, but nobody seems to know whether it was a victory or whether it was a defeat. Aging disc jockeys are prosecuted for crimes they committed decades ago, while practically no one in the City of London is prosecuted for the endless financial crimes that are being revealed there. In Syria, we are told that President Assad is the evil enemy, but then his enemies turn out to be even more evil than him. So we bomb them, and by doing that, we help keep Assad in power. But the real epicenter of this non-linear world is the economy. And the closest we have to our own shape-shifting, postmodern politician is George Osborne. He tells us proudly that the economy is growing, but at the same time, wages are going down. He says he is cutting the deficit, but then it's revealed that the deficit is going up. But the dark heart of this shape-shifting world is quantitative easing. The government is insisting on taking billions of pounds out of the economy through its austerity programme. Yet at the very same time, it is pumping billions of pounds into the economy through quantitative easing, the equivalent of £24,000 for every family in Britain. But it gets even more confusing, because the Bank of England have admitted that those billions of pounds have not gone where they are supposed to. A vast amount of the money has actually found its way into the hands of the wealthiest 5% in Britain. It has been described as the biggest transfer of wealth to the rich in recent documented history. It could be a huge scandal, comparable to the greedy oligarchs in Russia. A ruthless elite siphoning off billions of public money. But nobody seems to know. It sums up the strange mood of our time, where nothing really makes any coherent sense. We live with a constant vaudeville of contradictory stories that makes it impossible for any real opposition to emerge, because they can't counter it with a coherent narrative of their own. And it means that we as individuals become ever more powerless, unable to challenge anything, because we live in a state of confusion and uncertainty, to which the response is, oh dear. But that's
I just wanted to show that because I thought that was quite an interesting way of looking at the world as we find it, and the philosophy of Surkov, which is a constant state of destabilized perception. He describes his job, listen to this, my portfolio at the Kremlin and in government has included ideology, media, political parties, religion, modernization, innovation, foreign relations, and here he pauses and smiles, and modern art. He's written a short story, and I like this theory of non-linearity, which is this whole concept of non-linear war, or NATO call it ambiguous warfare, and I think it also is spilled into the markets. Writing about non-linear war, he says, in the primitive wars of the 19th and 20th centuries, it was common for two sides to fight, two countries, two groups of allies. Now 4 coalitions collided, not 2 against 2 or 3 against 1, no, all against all. And if you look at the world from the proxy wars we see in the Middle East, to shadow zones in Ukraine, to Ebola, you know, we see a very, very complex, multi-layered world, which is no longer, it's no longer simple to understand It's got so many cross currents. And I think this is importing a lot of uncertainty into how people look at the world today and how people understand it. Andrew here is an expert in security, but what is clear to all of us is that the asymmetric threat is not a military guy, it's a few individuals with a computer and some kind of ability to make an impact in society, from what happened in Paris to Boko Haram to what happened to us here at Westgate. If you look across the world and you look at just at the numbers, in Nigeria, you're looking at an increase year on year in Boko Haram of about 300% in terms of number of people killed. I mean, it is going off the scale. And one interesting observation I'd like to make, and I'm going to get to the markets in a minute. You know, you looked at something like Charlie Hebdo, where 17 people died. You looked at something like Baga, where we don't know how many people died, but more than 17. And what was interesting for me was the way, first of all, even our African leaders all made way to Paris. No one bothered to go to Nigeria. But what was interesting was, as we watched the debate happen on social media, after about 24 hours, people started asking this question. Why is Omar Bongo sitting in Paris when he's got his own challenges in Gabon? Is he really Je suis Charlie, or is he not? And what I think that told me was something very interesting, which is loss of control over the media in terms of the Western world has really largely owned the media. And I think social media has actually been a tremendous positive influence for us to get our voice heard, for people who went to say, if 2,000 people died in Baga, how does that compare to 17 people in Paris? Are those lives worth more? And I think that was extremely interesting as an observation. And then, of course, we're getting these photographs coming on practically every week. And what it is also, if you think of the imagery, if you look at people like Al-Shabaab, you look at Boko Haram, for people who are meant to be in the jungle, these guys are extraordinarily good at understanding the digital media. They are using the digital media in a very powerful way to get their message across. And there's a very famous quote by Don DeLillo, which I just want to touch on. In societies reduced to blur and glut, he says, terror is the only meaningful act. There's too much everything, more things and messages and meanings than we can use in 10,000 lifetimes. Inertia, hysteria, is history possible? Is anyone serious? Who do we take serious? Only the lethal believer, the person who kills for faith. Everyone else is absorbed. The culture hasn't figured out how to assimilate the terrorist. And he's saying the terrorist kills the innocent because that's the only language that the world understands. You know, we understand it when we see a photograph of this guy who was, by the way, a disc jockey in London and a rap singer, apparently. And there's a whole interesting area amongst this sort of new modern terrorists where they seem not to have come out of Africa. They're coming out of the Western world and coming back here. Let me move on now, after those observations, to a geopolitical level. What we have seen in the last 18 months is really the most sophisticated oil and currency warfare. And the oil and currency warfare specialist is that man. And I don't know how this guy, who was a community organizer, understood the financial markets in such a sophisticated manner that he managed to do what he has done. And I'm going to explain what he's done. And I listened to him very carefully. And I think it must be so annoying to be president of a country, to have launched something so sophisticated, and for the average population not to understand what you've done. You know, for a long time, people call him a weak leader. That's the way they accuse him. He is infinitely smarter. He didn't drop a bomb on Putin. a physical bomb. He dropped a financial bomb. And he constructed it. And I'm going to show you how he did it. This photograph, I think, is the moment Vladimir Putin realized he was in the doo-doo. This was taken, it was taken at APEC. It's amazing how images can tell you something. Look at that photograph, right? And that was sort of moments before it really hit him. You know, he's a geopolitical grandmaster, Vladimir Putin. We all know that, we appreciate that. If you're going to be fair in life, you've got to accept that. But he did not see this oil warfare specialist coming. This is the chart of oil, and that's about a 5-year chart. Look at it. It was staying at $90, between 90 and 100, for about 4 years, from post the Lehman crash. And that's when the oil warfare started at the top there. And today we're below $50. Now, look at what's happened here. This is the Russian ruble. If the Kenya shilling had done this same move, the Kenya shilling today would be at 170 against the dollar. Imagine what you guys would be doing in this room. There would be a revolution, I reckon. That was a direct consequence of what President Obama achieved by bringing down the price of oil. Of course, there is tremendous collateral damage. Angola, Nigeria. Nigeria's currency has dropped 9%. If you go back to Druckenmiller, you've got to say to yourself, that makes no sense. It's not possible. And they can't hold it. They've got a finger in the dike. They're trying to do that. But there's a tsunami coming at them. It's already hit here. But just to give you 2 charts, to give you an example of what has happened. As long ago as 2011, Thomas Donilon, who was the, I think, he was the US National Security Advisor, was telling us that they were going to do this. He said then in 2011, America's new energy posture allows us to engage from a position of greater strength. Increasing US energy supplies act as a cushion that helps reduce our vulnerability to global supply disruptions and price shocks. It also affords us a stronger hand in pursuing and implementing our international security goals. Oil market is like this. There was 80 million barrels per day of supply, and demand was about 80.5 million. What did the US do? They started doing shale drilling, and they started storing up the oil. And they stored it, and they stored it, and they stored it, and they waited, and they waited. And then in June last year, they started calling up Nigeria, man, we don't need the oil this year. Oh, Venezuela, no, we're okay. And in June and July, you had tankers and tankers on the open seas with no buyers. And suddenly you had what is called a fire sale. A fire sale is when people say, get me out, and I don't care what the price is, right? So we had the whole thing crash. It was beautifully constructed, really sophisticated. And of course, it's worth having a look, something like, compare the ruble, the naira, and the Venezuelan currency. Venezuela has crapped out. Ruble has crapped out. The only one that hasn't is the naira. And when I hear Emefiele say, we are going to defend that naira, you know, I don't know what he's thinking. Barack Obama, in his State of the Union address, points this out, which was a few days ago. So last year we were doing the hard work of imposing sanctions along with our allies. Some suggested that Mr. Putin's aggression was a masterful display of strategy and strength. Well, today it is America that stands strong and united with our allies, while Russia is isolated with its economy in tatters, which he put into tatters, right? And why was he saying that? Because the Americans didn't get it. He was telling them, this is what I did, this is what happened, right? Other big geopolitical issue is this. Are they going to be rehabilitated? I think they are. And increasingly, I think Havana, the rapprochement with Cuba, was the aperitif for this to happen. Now, that phrase I used about an arrhythmic world, this is the Euro-Swiss franc. This currency, early in January, moved. Can you see that move? That's a huge move for the Swiss franc. It's unbelievable. I've never seen a move like this since sterling, or since the late 90s. These are very, very big, dramatic moves happening in our markets. And that's just, there's a guy I follow on Twitter who gives some very good diagrams. And basically, the Europeans are starting to print 60 billion euros a month in quantitative easing. When that announcement came out, the euro collapsed in its biggest move since 2008. That's the dark line at the bottom. So if we look at the world is, I think, infinitely more complex than it was before. I think there's a degree of arrhythmia, and that this is now being imported into the markets. And sometimes if we look, it's so unusual. We always talk about the shilling. The shilling has hardly moved. The shilling's moved about 6%. And if I take everyone's conversation, they always tell me, Aly-Khan, the shilling, the shilling. The shilling's not moving. It's these things that are moving. Which brings us to Africa. This was a conference I went to in Maputo, which was hosted by the IMF and the Mozambican government, and it was called Africa Rising. And what I would like to mention just briefly before I drill down, it was rising, everything was rising in 2012. You had a leaky boat, that thing was going up. You had another leak, sprung another leak, that was going up. Today, it's not happening in that fashion. People are more discerning, and it's a lot more challenging now. IMF put out an economic update for Africa for 2015 and 2016. They downgraded it quite hard. 2014, expecting 4.8. Previous expectation was for 5.7. And 2016, 5.2, down from 6. And these movements are being driven in part because of the oil issue, right? I mean, if you look at somewhere like Nigeria, biggest component of sub-Saharan Africa after the rebasing, revenues coming out of oil prices down 50%, you're in trouble. And essentially they've been downgraded from about 7.5 to below 5. So a little bit of a more challenging Africa-wide environment that we're facing now compared to what we were looking at 2012 and 2013. I was thinking about what everyone talks about Africa rising, what is the big difference? I think the major difference is the phone. And what do I mean by that? Everybody in this room is on a phone. I remember a time in the 90s when I was a young boy, there were such few phones that we had. Today we have the smartphone. We are connected all over the world, and I think it's really been a silver bullet, and it's the most revolutionary thing that happened to our continent, actually, more than anything else. And it has so many different impacts, and I'm going to touch on them in a moment, but for me, more than anything, it's the phone that changed our continent. It connected us to each other, and it connected us to the rest of the world. I remember coming back 9 years ago, I had to build a 170-foot tower in Mombasa to get a 32K connection, and it was rubbish. And today, on my phone, I've got everything I can possibly want. And to me, that is a revolution in how we are. But it's creating enormous side effects, right? And let me give you a couple of examples. I think the African street, i.e. you, have a voice now, right? And we're seeing that in so many different places. This hyper-connectivity in our cities, I think, was directly responsible for events in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Then in Kinshasa, this month alone, 42 people died in the street. What was happening in Kinshasa? The president was trying to get an extra term. He actually was first of all trying to do a census and saying that this census will take a couple of years, therefore delaying the next election, and ultimately targeting a re-election. This is what the Senate president in Congo, in Kinshasa, said. Leon Kengo Wadondo said after the vote to discard the proposed census, we have responded to the street. When has anyone in Africa responded to the street? Look at what happened with the events in Nairobi about the playground. Within half an hour, that news was on the global media, Kenyan police gassing children. Now, before, no one would have bothered. It wouldn't have made the news. Today it makes the news. It goes global within minutes. The ability of people to make a difference is there in a way which did not exist before. And we're seeing it from Ouagadougou to Kinshasa to Wilson Airport. And I think that it is a momentous moment, actually, and it is going to create a lot of political change. And what is clear to me is that the street has a voice and has muscle, and this is definitely a new development. Everyone sees it in a very binary way. Will it be a collision between the US and China and Africa? You know, if last year you couldn't not look at the news and Barack Obama was coming or the premier of China was coming. You know, I don't think we've been courted like this ever. Suddenly, you know, we're the belle of the ball. It's quite nice. The question is, in an adversarial world, is it going to be win-win? We're all winners. Everyone's a winner, baby, as Hot Chocolate used to sing. Or is it something different? And I think ultimately, you know, the win-win theory is not going to be the right one. And I think it'll become much more adversarial. And recently, for example, China put in a battalion of soldiers into South Sudan, 700 soldiers. It's the first time China has put feet on the ground, military feet on the ground on the continent. And I think that was actually an important statement and development. If I can jump now to the Indian Ocean world. Professor Felipe Fernandez Amesto, describing the Indian Ocean, why it was such an incredible trading system. The precocity of the Indian Ocean as a zone of long-range navigation and cultural exchange is one of the glaring facts of history, made possible by the reversible escalator of the monsoon. What this means is the monsoon would bring you from as far as India to Maputo and all points in between, and then it would turn around and it would take you back, all in a year. That's why the Indian Ocean economy started to pick up 400 or 500 years ago. That's why if you go to the coastal areas, you'll find incredible mixtures of people from all kinds of places. The reason they could do that was because of that wind. And Amesto is also saying, rather than be part of a once lost and anarchic continent, the area from Mozambique north to Ethiopia may be in the process of becoming a critical nodal point of the dynamic Indian Ocean world. And I think it's an interesting thing for me. If you look at that rim of the Indian Ocean, we have 3 billion people living from Maputo all the way around. That's a huge economy. And I think we're going to see a massive resurgence in that Indian Ocean economy for a number of reasons. But it's interesting that that was its historical reason of its success, and I think it's going to be resurgent again. Returning back to that point I was making about China and the US, everyone has forgotten about this document that the US put out, which was called the Pivot to Asia. And that was about President Obama moving resources into that part of Asia. And what is happening is, what we know now is the US does not need much oil anymore. Who needs it? China. China is totally dependent on imported crude oil. And their dependency is increasing. The US is decreasing. Now think about it from a military point of view. If you control the ocean, you control China. You can close China by just shutting down the ships. And therefore, in my view, in a geopolitical view, the control of the Indian Ocean is now very decisive. And from the US national interest, they want to maintain the ability to close it down. And if you go to that pivot document, the pivot document speaks about two scenarios. It speaks about having to respond to a Chinese attack, and it talks of a blinding air, sea, something or other. It's not going to happen. You can't kill millions of people. What you can do is you can close it down using coercive sanctions, like they're using on Russia. So I think therefore the Indian Ocean has become a very central area of control. Moving on, the Teflon shilling, I call it, because it just doesn't go down. Look at it. Compare it to any other currency in Africa. That red line is Ghana, which at one point was down 45%, ended the year down about 31%. The trend was all softer against the dollar, because the dollar is now emerging from a multi-year weak spot. It's going to go a lot higher. And the point I'm making is actually, when you look at the shilling is incredibly well behaved. You wouldn't believe it reading the newspaper, but actually it is. And there are reasons for that, in part, I think, because we underestimate how much money is coming in from Kenyans abroad. You know, for the central bank to collect all that information is very hard. They said $1.5 billion came in last year, which was the highest on record. I think the number is near 3. And that is where the strength of the shilling comes from. And this year it's also going to be helped because our biggest expense in our business of Kenya Inc. is oil. We're paying half what we were paying before. That's going to make a very, very positive difference because we don't have to find so many dollars. So I think, you know, overall, shilling is going down 95, 96 maybe, but that is not a shilling story. It's a story about the dollar. And the dollar is going to come back very, very strong this year. And the first rate increase out of the Fed is going to send these currencies much lower. And it doesn't even have to be up 1%. It could be a quarter point. That quarter point will put a lot of pressure, and that will be the second round of pressure. If President Obama really wants to send Russia over the edge, put up interest rates a quarter point, and you'll see what will happen. For us, last year was incredible. If you'd gone to somebody and said, can the government of Kenya borrow $2.75 billion in the international markets? Everybody said, you're smoking pot. What are you talking about? 2.75 billion? We raised $2.75 billion from the capital markets. It was a huge, huge call. And I think it speaks to an opening up. And it also has very positive knock-on effects. Our corporate sector can now go and say, I want to borrow money, we've got a benchmark bond out here, I'll pay you 50 basis points extra. And suddenly we've got a whole different financial architecture around us. And I think we can't underestimate the degree of progress that has happened in our financial markets. And I give full credit because I remember not too long ago when the place was a bit of a mess after, you know, big IPOs in 2007. You know, we had there's been a lot of reform. They're now talking of a futures market coming into play. Lots of positive things coming out of our capital markets. This was obviously a very, very big thing. And what this does is twofold, and it's having a very dynamic change. What it's doing, it means our policymakers have to be aware of what these bonds are doing. What it means is bondholders now have the ability to price our credit on a continuous basis. If policymakers pop up and make a bad policy or an extreme policy, the price of these bonds is going to react very quickly. And this is what's happened to Ghana. You know, Ghana made classic mistakes. It was this poster child. If you went around 2-3 years ago, it was all Ghana. President Obama went to Ghana. Everyone was going to Ghana. Where is it now? Right? What did they do? They borrowed billions of dollars of Eurobonds and they put their own salaries up. Right? In reality, that's what actually happened. So the bond is a very big positive, and I also think it will have a positive impact on policy making because suddenly you won't be able to do the highly irrational things. Coming to us in Kenya, carrying on with us, this is I think, you know, the interesting statistic I came across from McKinsey. McKinsey put out something called iGDP. The component of GDP that is internet, new economy, mobile money, you know, the more sexy parts of this of any economy. And they put our iGDP at 2.9%, which is the same level as France and Germany. They had South Africa at 1.4, Nigeria at 0.8. And I think this is a major piece of strength of our economy. I am bullish about our economy because of these sorts of things. We're not oil. By the way, oil is dead. Takana oil, if they're fighting about it, I don't know what they're fighting about, because no one's digging it out of the ground at this price. We have to come back, for that oil exploration to come back, $80. $80, we're nowhere near it right now. The markets have already reacted. You look at the share price of Tullow, you look at the, if Tullow, Africa Oil and Afren were listed at the Nairobi Securities Exchange, they would be the worst performing shares over the last 12 months, bar none, right? I mean, Afren has fallen 97%. You put 100 bob, you got 3 bob left, buddy, right? You put into Tullow 100 bob, I think it's about 45 bob. Africa Oil 100 bob, 25 bob. Now, markets are telling you something loud and clear. So that's just a point to make, and I think people that maybe have not yet internalized that story delayed, 5 years delay, according to my best estimate. But where we're losing on that side, we're winning on another side. Why are we winning? Well, I'm not winning because everyone's got their car on the road now because the price has come down. But the point I'm making is that extra money in people's pocket, don't underestimate it. It's a lot of money. In the US, it's worth $1 trillion. It's worth $750 per household per year. I estimate here it's worth about $1 a day when we get the price feed through, which has to come through. Next month will be down another 10 bob, and we'll get there eventually to probably 60 shillings a litre if everything was fair. You can imagine how that's going to help our economy. People are going to have a lot more money in their pocket. Hopefully they won't only drive around with that money, they'll invest it. Returning to iGDP, this is for me one of the big strengths of our economy, and I think you can't underestimate what a strong support it is. You know, if you look at any kind of data across the continent, we are so far away ahead of it. We're a leader, or as Malcolm Gladwell calls it, an outlier. You know, average urban internet usage is 25%. We're at 47. This room is at 100, right? I mean, you know, or 99. I'm off it. And if you look at the ICT component of the economy, that has been the strongest growing part of the economy. If you stripped out ICT and that iGDP of our economy, we didn't grow for 10 years. This was the area of growth. If you took everything out, the economy was actually very, very flat. It was this piece that added the juice. And you see that in social media, you see that in the conversation we have. This is the volume of tweets taken, I think it was in about 2012. And we were actually on par with Egypt and South Africa. And Egypt, bear in mind, was having a revolution at that time, so everybody was tweeting. There's lots of debate about digital, about the migration. I don't know about the minutiae of that migration, but I think in a general way, what's happening is people have gone from broad to narrow. By broad, I mean, once upon a time, we all watched The Voice of Kenya, right? I don't know if you remember, we'd have the national anthem, we'd know whether the president had been to the toilet, and then we'd find the news, you know? But you remember, you know, it's today, it was those old days, but no one is watching media like that anymore, whether they're in New York or Nairobi. We're watching it in a totally different way. You know, we're spending more time in the niches. We're going to areas that we were interested in. We're watching it when we want to watch it. We are interacting with each other. Somebody will send me a tweet. Have you seen this? Peter will send me a tweet. Have you watched the FT? Have you seen this? And then I'll go and watch it. This is a whole different way of operating. And it's very revolutionary, I think. And people prefer the niches because it's more immersive. If you're like a windsurfer, what's the voice of Kenya going to tell you about it? But some guy will have a TV channel which will be purely focused on windsurfing that you can go and immerse yourself in, or with Sadia's music, you want to follow that, there you go. And I think that has also changed it from a societal point of view. Now, coming to us, what's going to happen? There's tourism. I'm from Mombasa. I was down there, and I was playing Spot the Mzungu Tourist. I couldn't spot any, right? So when people tell me it's coming back, it's not coming back right now. Why? Because I've sat in London. People book a holiday 12 months in advance. They'll tell you for 12 months, I'm going here. And they'll be excited about it. That's how that market works. It's not not many people are doing it spur of the moment. They're planning it way ahead. And until we see some improvement in security, and I don't think anyone can predict when that improvement will happen. Until that happens, I don't see how Mombasa is going to recover. And I remember Mombasa in the late 90s. And I used to live in Yali, and there was a time when everything was for sale. And I'm really worried about Mombasa because I think everybody's not considering the situation. I mean, there were hotels down there where I sat down, and there was semi-full, and the guy said, I got 4 rooms sold. My hotel cost me $250,000 a month. These guys cannot keep going. It's not possible. And the worry is that actually it gets worse before it gets better. And I think this is the drag on the economy this year. Al-Shabaab, if you looked in 2014, just do a chart analysis or numbers analysis, I mean, it was a much, much bigger impact than it was the previous year, the year before, the year before. So, and that trend line, whether you're looking at it Africa-wide, you're looking at it globally, or you're honing in and saying, what about us? That remains an uncertainty, or what we can call it an unknown known. We know it's there, but what's unknown is what's going to happen next. And then counterbalancing this is what's supporting us is this opening up of the capital markets, our ability to access cash, which wasn't there before. And that makes the challenge for us different. Before, you wouldn't get the money. Today you can get the money, but you've now got to spend it wisely and do well with it. If you've got $2.75 billion of bonds and you're paying interest on it of 5–6%, your return has got to be significantly above with that money. If out of the 2.75 you say, hang on a second, we'll give 300 over here, 200 here, and you're left with 1 billion to invest, you're never going to make it. You're going to end up in the problems that we've had before. So it's a different challenge, but it's a better challenge, but it is a challenge. And I think the big thing this year is going to be this massive stimulus coming from oil, which is why, if I go back to the stock exchange, 3-year bull market, it's going to be a 4th year, in my view. If I'm already seeing hard data out of corporates, they're already seeing a boost from this lower oil price. So imagine if we get down to 60, what we're going to see.